Welcome to Psychology to Live By. Today is a Q&A with some very kindly people. The podcast to be discussed today is the second of two podcasts in the Thee or Me series, and it's subtitled Altruism and Compassion. Our participants, as usual, have watched the podcast of that name, and you can see or listen to it at my website, drchris.life. But I'll do a quick summary now before we jump into the Q&A. In part one of Thee or Me, we address the question of why people sometimes act altruistically and at other times selfishly. In part two, we're going to see what light evolutionary psychology can shed on these questions, and then we turn our attention to how we can be better, how we can build character, and why we should cultivate compassion. I think the crowning glory of Homo sapiens is our ability to cooperate. Views of human nature as only selfish ignore our deep social wiring, especially our inbuilt tendencies to kindness and compassion. Known in evolutionary psychology as reciprocal altruism, we come hardwired to love and care for those close to us. We are wired to contribute as well as to take, to be gentle as well as aggressive, to tell the truth, but also to deceive others and, of course, ourselves. In other words, being human is an incurably uncertain and contradictory business and reflects the complexities of our social interdependence. So what's one to do with all of this? Well, one solution is ongoing humility and self-skepticism. We should proceed with caution in the full knowledge of our biases, checking our intuitions and feelings with as rational and as impartial analysis as we can. This is the basis for the development of character. At a community level, knowing our species' biases and self-interest sway our judgments, we should strive to protect the separation of powers, especially of the judiciary. Likewise, we should strongly support independent, high-quality journalism, academic freedom, and institutional and professional expertise. In short, we should always value the fruits of societal cooperation and cultural progress. In the long run, we'll all benefit by engaging in non-zero-sum games. So how do we appropriately limit our natural desires for self-interest and our distrust, dislike, or enmity for others? Well, firstly, by understanding we are all alike. We're all contradictory. We're all biased. Knowing this, we can direct compassion towards self and others with the attendant positive emotions of kindness and caring. There's always wisdom in such compassion because it understands that your well-being will support my well-being. There's also practicality, as the generation of compassion negates my negative emotions and thereby opens my mind and my heart. All right, so let's go to our Q&A component of today. And here are the three kindly people I promised. And let's start with your questions, insights, observations of part two, altruism and compassion. Who would like to kick off proceedings?
This time I'll go first.
Fantastic.
What I got from it is I am an incurable mess. I have compassion on one shoulder, I have empathy on the other, and they're all fighting for my attention.
Yeah.
I'm locked into my wokeness. I'm locked into my thousands of years of hereditary anchors. And you give me one solution? And it's not really a solution. It's a discussion. But it's such a big topic.
Yeah.
Holy moly. You know? And I think as we've talked before, it's definitely viewed through the lens of culture. And every culture is going to look at this really quite differently.
Yeah.
And probably be annoyed and upset and offended based on how other cultures look at the same thing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what do you do?
Yeah, it's a real. I mean, we're not going to solve this, but I think we can make some headway. Um, First thing, Terry, is yes. I mean, obviously, um, you're a human, and humans are complex. We're all like this. Often we don't realise how contradictory we are, how full of contradictions, how full of opposing forces, and we tend to think of ourselves as quite unitary beings, and there's one Terry in here, one Chris in here, and it's obviously not the case that different Terrys and different Chris's come forth at different times, and it's probably truer to say that we have a kind of community of selves that is, varying levels of harmony and disharmony within ourselves. So, but we also tend also to look at other people as if they're unitary, right? And clearly they're not. And so there's the clue, I think, is that if we look at other people and we're fully cognizant of their capacity for good and evil, that we ought to speak to the part of them, we ought to be doing our level best to elicit the part of them that's more useful, that's more for good rather than evil. All right. So, but there's so many things that you've touched on there. I think you were also touching on the incommensurability between cultures, that sometimes the way one culture looks at something is very, very different to how another culture looks at it. And that's obviously true. Even if we say if you just divided the world into people who believe there is, an external God and those who don't. Right? And we could make these divisions in countless ways. What's the solution to this? And I just wanted to check something with you, Terry, but I'm assuming that where some of this is coming from is this kind of very pronounced polarization that we're currently facing, particularly in the Western world. Was that part of what was prompting your thoughts?
Yeah, and it's a polarization that really, the roots are obviously thousands of years old, right?
Yeah,
But it's really only for me, has become really front and center in the last 6 years.
yeah,
And
and,
so
yeah,
what was hiding it under a sheen of politeness and a sheen of listening versus right now, no one listens and everyone attacks.
yeah. I think there is one thing we can say that's quite significant here. Is that in the evolutionary context, in the context of a small village, and a group of villagers that you would live with for your entire life, everyone actually knows everyone. They're actually living cheek by jowl. You got to find a way of compromising and getting on with each other, right? Because it would be intolerable to be living that close, literally sleeping next to people. So I think that's what we were designed for. And fast forward now, what we have, of course, is an international community of villages. We've got many, many, many villages, and we can move around between them. So we don't have that immediate responsibility and accountability to each other, right? So that's been a long-term development. And then overlaid on that very significantly, I think, is social media, in which people's views can become more and more extreme and reinforced in the sort of echo chamber of their group. And so there is no need, it feels like there's no need to compromise. In fact, the mind becomes so saturated with one view that it becomes obviously true. So I think what was there as a sort of as half of the story has become more like 90% of the story, psychologically speaking. Whereas in our natural environment, that for which we were designed, there are a lot more moderating forces, practical, pragmatic, everyday moderating forces. Now, the third part, I don't know how many parts there were to your observations. There was a lot, but another part is, what the hell do we do about it? And as you said, my suggested solution was really just a starting point. And that is, first we have to recognize this. We have to recognize that we as individuals are as caught up and as lost and misguided as they are, that no one is immune from this. And, whether it's the left or the right, the religious, the non-religious, everyone thinks they're right and the other bastards are wrong, right? And they get plenty of... There's another element of this, which we have touched on in other podcasts, and this is the idea of status games and esteem. And people get extraordinary esteem by being polarized, right? Within that status game, within that grouping, the more extreme they are, in fact, the more status they get. So unfortunately, we've also got these incentives now to be extreme and to be, So it's a devilish problem though. But I think, all we can do is one person at a time, one conversation at a time, try to make ground for people. I mean, I think above all, if we understand this, we can make sure we are respectful of others, even people with whom we strongly disagree. Yeah, but I'm not pretending it's going to be straightforward. Brilliant, Terry. I'm glad you jumped in first, because that I've had a long answer to that, but it warranted it. Okay, who's next out of you two?
Whew.
So there's so many things to unpack and think through here. I'm going to try to be concise. The notion of that, that reciprocal altruism, one of the things that I kind of thought about also is that, like, as you kind of go up in scale, the relationship or the ratio between cooperation and conflict changes, right? So when you're within the tribe, cooperation is very high, interconflict is very low.
Mm-hmm.
But from tribe to tribe, level of conflict comes up, collaboration goes down. City to city, same thing starts to happen, and then you're always, I'm part of this city, or and we don't like people from that other city. But then when we're all in the same country, we're people from this country, but we don't like people from that other country, right? And so people have this ability to scale up their tribe when faced with the sort of challenge of what the other side is presenting to some degree.
Yes.
And to your comment about social media, actually has been, I was thinking about, like, there's two sides. My first reaction was like, actually, social media might have like one of the greatest features of it is that it shines a light on net negative collaborative behavior in a way that we've never had the ability to do before.
Yeah.
Right. And it exposes that contrarian action, whether that's an individual or a group of individuals or, larger. Where the challenge comes in is that we see an individual behaving negatively and we ascribe that to a group. Right. And so we say that person's doing something really bad that I don't agree with. And that person's part of that other group. And so that whole group are nasty buggers that are all doing this nasty activity, when that is just such an overgeneralization that seems to connect to that sense of, I got to protect my tribe.
Yeah, so much there. I might just start with that last point. Again, if we think about, all evolved human sort of cognitive appraisal capabilities, they're all sort of quick and dirty, you know, like they just help us get by in the hurly-burly of, you know, pressing needs. So, you know, in our ancestral past, other tribes were first to be feared or worried about rather than embraced, right? And this distinction between empathy and altruism is important here, right? So we're hardwired to have empathy for those close to us. So obviously kin, you know, close relatives, and then by extension, my friends and maybe people in my tribe. Certainly people that sound like, look like me, right? And so, you know, racism can be seen as one of the natural things that emerges from our reliance on empathy as a means of, you know, connecting or not connecting. Because the dark side of empathy, of course, is antipathy, right? And so, you know, then as you say, there's then this sort of amplification in scale, right? And so, you know, eventually, you know, we would have found some other tribes that you know, we could trade with, and then we're rubbing shoulders with those people, and we begin to realise, oh, they're just like us. So that now empathy can be extended to them, right? And then maybe races mix, and you get to live and make friends with someone who's a different colour than you or whatever, and you realise, oh, he or she's just like me, and so now I can extend empathy to them, right? So that familiarity with people. But the problem is we weren't really evolved for large numbers, right? So, for example, we might there might be, you know, 1 million people who die each year from starvation, for example. But on our news, there's one case of, I don't know, some parents who don't feed their kid and the kid dies of starvation. Horrible. But that's going to get massive attention and it's going to evoke a lot in people, whereas the 1 million is just a statistic that our mind can't comprehend, right? So there's a way in which empathy is innumerate. You know, it can't cope with scale. So what's the answer? Well, I think a more enlightened altruism, like a more enlightened, compassionate, wise understanding, right? And that's the hard thing. Now there was something else you were talking about there, Chris, as well, though, wasn't there? What was the other thing that you had in your mind there?
Oh boy, I really went down the wormhole. I guess the idea of like the shining a light, the social media and the internet,
yes,
shining a light on negative.
Yes, you're quite right to sort of correct me in that, you know, I'd only given the negative side of social media, but it does have this other. The internet in general has this other potentiality, which we were all very, very, very excited about when the internet started, before it was sort of, I guess, colonized by advertising. But I think that there is that potential for it to actually break up sort of hardened distinctions between groups. It can shed light on, you know, and we can bring our natural empathy to bear because we can be familiarised with people otherwise we wouldn't have. But I think one of the problems, again, is one of these natural biases in human nature, and again, one that was formed for a smaller group, and that is that what's more salient to us, what really grabs our attention, is the negative, is bad news, is something, you know, controversy. And of course, see, no one planned this, I don't think, you know. no one designed the internet, in that sense. But that one thing has led, and then you link that to advertising, and how do you attract eyeballs?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And you attack people, or you say horrible things, and a lot of reality TV follows the same formula.
Start a fight, yeah.
You start a fight, so controversy and animus and bad things. So there's a war going on, but I feel like it's an uneven war because of our natural biases to the negative. So, regulation and all kinds of things I think are very important here. Again, as I was saying in the previous podcast, really valuing the separation of powers, of an independent judiciary, for example, because we know we'll just want revenge left to our own devices. We need these, regulation, ways of regulating our nature. That's the wise thing. Yeah. But yeah, again, as with Terry's question, we're going to solve it here, but at least we can start opening up and thinking about it in a slightly different way. Righto, Colleen, that leaves you. What's been lurking in that febrile mind of yours?
No, I love everything that everyone discussed. I think I feel the same way. I think it can be fear-based, everything that grabs what you're afraid of. And
yes,
social media takes the human side out of it sometimes and allows people to hide behind whatever it is they're hiding behind. They're not forced to feel the empathy or the humility and I think that becomes a learned behavior, and then they don't know how to deal with it. So I really feel like it needs to be regulated in some way so that we can, because I don't think it's all negative. I think that we're able to see how other people live and different cultures and learn from so much of it. But I just don't
entirely. Yes, it's interesting what you say, and this is to expand on that point about the lack of accountability. Because people say things in social media that I'd imagine, generally speaking, they wouldn't say face to face to people.
Mm-mm.
And that's because there's not that immediate existential encounter with another warm-bodied human, right opposite you. And so, it's like an expansion of gossip. I mean, gossip's always been an important part of human commerce, right? And gossip is a way of being inducted and accepted into, a status game, a social group, a coalition. And it's an important human skill, right? But it's so massively amplified by social media that we can become completely removed from the other humans that are involved. I mean, eventually in a small village, the other person's going to hear the gossip and come and and talk to you about it face to face. And without that restraint on us, we see what happens, right? But you're absolutely right again to point out the other side, how extraordinary it is to get intimate insight into other humans that we've never met, people that we would very unlikely ever meet, but we can do it this way. The information we can get, the sense of our common humanity, it has never been so possible, right? But, look, and I don't know, I'm not an expert on these matters, but it does seem to me that there's more and more talk now about from within these media companies, with government, there is more talk about regulation. There is more talk about we can't just let this thing run amok.
Except for Twitter.
Well, that's right. That's a really interesting example. Who knows where that one's going to go? But again, that's a problem simply because you've got one person.
Yeah.
Rather than a wise collective who are deciding what to do. I'm not saying that what preceded was a wise collective either, but look, I think we're just starting to we really are starting to understand how our human nature can be distorted by these technologies. Mm-hmm. And I'd imagine over the next kind of 20 years or so, there's going to be a lot more. We'll learn some things, and we'll put things in play. I mean, I know my kids, who are sort of 30s and 40s. I shouldn't call them kids, should I? But they engage far less in social media than they used to. They kind of got a bit disillusioned. They're far more discerning and careful and so on. I'd imagine that's probably going to happen, out of the pain and suffering that people experience. But again, the answer to all these things, and the antidote, is compassion and altruism. I just want to say one thing that didn't come up that maybe is worth saying, and we'll finish on this, is why the evolutionary psychologists call it reciprocal altruism and not just altruism. And it's not that when people are altruistic, they're expecting reciprocation, right? Because generally speaking, that's not people's experience. When they're being kind, they're just being kind, and they get pleasure from the kindness, right? And so it's not a cynical move of self-interest, right? But why do we call it reciprocal altruism? And it's because when it is not reciprocated, in other words, when I'm in need, when I'm in a situation, when the other person doesn't repay the kindness, our circuits get outraged, right? And because it was not reciprocated at a later point in time when it ought to have been. And I think this is this again speaks to the binding and bonding nature of altruism, right? But as with the prisoner's dilemma and tit for tat, if the person doesn't reciprocate, we have circuits here that get outraged, that become righteous, because that's such a threat to our survival if kindness and care and altruism is not reciprocated, right? You can't run a society or even a village if you don't have that, all right? So just thought I'd throw that in. But I feel like we've barely touched the issues here, but maybe enough just to stimulate some thought and interest. All right, guys. So as always, I appreciate you enormously. Thank you for watching and coming up with those great questions. And I look forward to our next encounter. All right, guys. Take care.